Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Karen Rawson, and as Vice President of the DESARA Group, I'd like to thank you for joining the DESARA Group's webinar today. Our topic today is performance evaluation and internal audits, which continues our key concept series on the significant aspects of ISO 9001-2015. Our session is being recorded, so everyone's muted, and we encourage you to use the GoToWebinar features. I have a little slide here that shows what those are in case people haven't used those yet. You can minimize the panel if it's showing up on your screen right now just by clicking that little orange arrow at the top. That'll minimize it. You can pull it back out using that same orange button so that you can ask questions, make comments. There's a full screen button. Everyone is muted by default, so we will not be using the hand raise feature today, but instead we encourage you to use the questions panel. Ask us questions. I like seeing how many people are already answering our first question of the day about have you been to our webinars before and what other kinds of ISO 9001-2015 activities have you been involved in. And ask your questions throughout. I'll summarize them at the end, or I'll read them aloud. Only the speakers will see your questions. So we'll just read them aloud without identifying the name of your company when we read them out at the end. And any that we can't answer during the course of the webinar, we will cover in future webinars, in newsletters, articles, and possibly by getting back to you directly. In a minute, we'll get to our content for today. We can take a look at the agenda. We'll give a little bit about DESARA Group, and then we'll get right into the agenda. Now, about DESARA, we're a consulting company that started back in 2008 to work with companies who want to improve their effectiveness and efficiency. We use standards like ISO 9001 as a foundation. We're experts in contributing authors to TL 9000 that builds on ISO 9001 for telecom. We're also using standards like ISO 20000, ISO 27001 for information security, and so on. But we go way beyond just implementing standards with our clients. That's just the starting point, to have that organized, systematic approach to quality or information security or environmental management and so forth. And we particularly specialize in working with companies who've grown by acquisition or have complex processes around the globe. But just this coming week, we're working with somebody who's doing ISO 9001 for the very first time. So we run the full range. We're spending a lot of time this year supporting companies in transitioning to the new training and who are, like I said, starting ISO 9001 for the first time. As we work with clients, we're finding they appreciate our ability to completely tailor all of our training and consulting engagements to their unique needs. We will meet you right where you are. For example, one company just wanted 3 days with a simple gap assessment and some training on risk assessment, and they felt very good on a number of other fronts. All the way up to companies who want 5 full days of intense training and coached assessments and so forth. So we can come in and meet you exactly where you are and work with you based on the level of rigor that you want to put into transitioning. So we hope that you will get in touch with us if you are needing some support with your ISO 9001 2016 transition or initial implementation. That's why we do these webinars, so that you can become familiar with us. Our speaker today is Joe Barckett. He's a senior consultant with DESARA, and he's been working in the field of quality improvement for his entire career. He's a master black belt with a long list of businesses and individual black belts that he's coached to millions of dollars in savings. But at the root of all those savings, he knows you have to have a baseline process management system that's in control. And that's what ISO 9001 should allow companies to achieve. So when Joe walks into a business, whether it's manufacturing or service, to improve their effectiveness using Six Sigma or Lean or any other methods, he immediately looks at the state of their quality management system as well, whether formal or informal, and sometimes takes them right back to the basics that are included in ISO 9001. So I know you'll find Joe to be an engaging speaker, those of you who have been in our webinars in the past, and now I'd like to turn over the mic to Joe Barckett for our presentation. Joe.
Thank you, Karen, for all that great stuff you talk about me. And hello to everyone, especially the first time as well as the returning people. As always, make sure that you ask questions, put them in the question panel, and Karen will filter through them, and we'll get to them at the end when we have some time to do that. You've already seen our agenda slide, so the first thing that we want to talk about is a little bit about this evolution. And I know you probably are tired of hearing about 9000 and the evolution and how it's gone from this to that from 1987. But I think it's important for our discussion today specifically because we're talking about why we're here. If we look at the evolution over the years, 1987 standard, if those of you that remember way back then, had 20 elements to it. Basically, it was a product-based standard. The 94 Rev didn't change that. The elements really focused on product quality. Did the product meet the quality of the customer? Did it meet the requirements of the customer? When the 2000 standard was released, it had made a transition. It had gone basically from product-based to process-based. They did away with the 20 elements, and they put in place 8 clauses. They made some changes in 2008, but really didn't change the fact that it was process-based, that we wanted to be using the process-based approach. We talked about continuous improvement of the quality management system and not just about products in this 2008 Rev. We also talked about effectiveness. We went a little bit away from intent and implementation, do what you say and say what you do, and we started focusing a little bit more on the effectiveness of the QMS. So it was no longer just a conformance issue, but it was also an effectiveness issue. Did this standard, did the things that you're doing in this quality management system help make your business better? In 2015, we saw yet another change. It has now moved into a performance-based system. There's a clause, Clause 9, which we're going to talk about today, called just that, performance evaluation. Clearly, there were pieces of performance in the old revs, but they now have been pulled together into one clause, and it allows us to better fit into that PDCA cycle that we've always chatted about. I feel this is significant for top management to understand, and I also think that it's very significant for the auditors to understand because it's going to change the way they audit. The key here now is that we need to focus on how effective the system is and how we know that the QMS is being effective, and the way we do that is data-based. So we're getting back to the quality principle not only of performance from the process approach, but also data-based decision-making, these quality principles that the standard is based on. All right, enough about the evolution. Let's talk about why that's important to us. The evolution has been important because it now helps us put emphasis on where it should be, effective, effective, effective. One of the first things I'll talk to senior management about when I sit down to do an internal audit with them is I'll ask them, how has the system, how has your quality management system, how has your ISO 9001 system helped improve the business? That's the whole point of the system, is it needs to be effective. If we're doing this and we're not getting benefits out of it, then we need to be questioning ourselves as to why we're spending all this time and energy into getting it done. So effectiveness is key. Once we focus on effectiveness, a lot of good things begin to happen. Clearly, continual improvement can happen now since top management now has the data on what's performing well and what's not performing. They should have data on where the waste is and how much that waste is costing us. That hopefully leads to increased customer satisfaction. General business improvement should lead to general customer satisfaction as well as increased profitability of the business. So I feel that this evolution to performance-based, not necessarily totally away from process-based, but more effectiveness-related, is significant to top management, and it's also significant to the auditors, since they may need to change how they audit, moving away from conformance a little bit, moving towards performance of the system. All right. Let's talk about Clause 9 and performance evaluation. This is a new section, but it's very familiar content for us. Essentially, they've combined the old 5-6 management review, the old 8-2 monitoring and measuring, which includes customer sat, internal audits, measuring and monitoring of process as well as product, and finally the old 8-4 analysis. All of these now are wrapped up into this performance evaluation section called Section 9, and this is a good thing for us because it puts it all in one place. It allows the auditors now to have a real good handle on what it is they need to be looking at, just from one clause, instead of having to find their way through several different clauses of performance issues. All of it brings us back to the check part of the PDCA cycle. We've discussed this in earlier webinars, the fact that this new structure, Annex SL, is set up so that the clauses fit neatly into a PDCA cycle. And 9 clearly fits into this check cycle where we're monitoring, measuring processes and results versus plan. So it's more linkage back to those quality principles of process approach, database decision making. And that's what the standard is based on, and that's what we're trying to get through in terms of putting these requirements out there. All right, 9.1, subclause 9.1, monitoring and measuring analysis and evaluation, all in one clause. It's a great way for us to do it. As we go through these slides, don't forget about your questions. Put them down and we'll answer them at the end. So here's the actual requirements. Let's focus on the first paragraph. Let's focus on the what. The organization shall determine what needs to be monitored and measured. It also needs to determine the methods. How are we going to measure these things, and how will we assure that the data is valid? Measurement system analysis, calibration. What are we measuring from the input level, the output level, and those key processes? And we'll spend a little bit more time on that in a minute. When the monitoring and measuring shall be performed. Where in the process are we going to do these measures? Not only do we have to outline what they are and how we're going to do them, what methods we're going to have, but when are these monitoring and measuring methods going to be performed? And then finally, when will the results from these monitoring and measuring going to be analyzed and evaluated? Are we looking at a daily analysis? Are we looking at a monthly or weekly? What's the plan? For those of you that are familiar with control plans, you might be getting some flashbacks here, because this is a lot of the information that are in what we would call control plans. And the automotive industry and the aerospace industry has been using these for quite some time. All of this brings us back to our SIPOC map. If we look down at the bottom, we've got possible controls and checkpoints to monitor and measure performance. And one of the things you'll notice is that the arrows emanating from that box go to various places in our SIPOC map. And so when the standard tells us to determine what needs to be measured, we have multiple places to choose from as to where those measures are going to be. If we use our SIPOC map, we can identify some of these locations. The first is these output indicators. The most common type of measure is the measure of product quality. These output indicators have various names. They call them Ys, they call them dependent variables, they might be called critical customer requirements or even critical business requirements. They may be required by the customer, and generally what they're measuring are product or service characteristics. They are statistical quality control, SQC in nature, and they measure at the end of the process as the product is either being inspected or as the service is actually being delivered. There are some issues with these measures. It's too late for us to do anything about the quality of product or service at this point, but generally they're things that we have to measure to assure that we're meeting the requirements of the customer. If we back up a little into the process itself, there are process indicators that we can measure. These are sometimes called X's, or independent variables. And generally, they're process parameters like times, temperatures, pressures. They should be linked to the output indicator. The third place we can look at it is at the inputs. Again, like the process measures, these are called X's, or independent variables, and we would like these as well to be linked with the output indicators. Our goal here is to identify those X's at the inputs and at the process activities that affect those Y's at the output indicators. The theory is control the X's and you control the Y's. Let's talk a little bit about an example everybody's familiar with, and that's the pizza delivery example. You've probably heard this if you've been to any of our courses, but typically when we talk about pizza delivery, we talk about what are the requirements of the customer. And one of the requirements that always comes up is I want my pizza to be hot. And in fact, I just saw a new ad on TV, and I forget who it is, it might be Domino's, who has a new vehicle where they actually have a heating oven in the actual vehicle. I forget what it's called. And so the voice of the customer says, I want my pizza hot. That's not the requirement. Part of what we have to do as quality professionals is take that voice of the customer and turn it into a requirement we can work with. And so let's say we settle with the customer that the requirement is 125 plus or minus 10 degrees F. Well, the output indicator would tell us that we're going to measure the pizza temperature just as we deliver it to the customer. And so we may get an infrared thermometer just before we ring the doorbell. We open up the pizza box and measure the temperature of the pizza to see if it's at 125 plus or minus 10. These are typical measures we do in our manufacturing and in our service processes. We measure at the end of the line, is the product good? Does it meet the requirements of the customer? Does the service meet the requirements of the customer? We typically have to do some of these in order for us to assure the customer and ourselves that we're meeting their requirements. However, from the continuous improvement point of view, they're not very useful because it's too late to do much about that. I'm not going to make the pizza hotter by breathing on it to get it up to 125 plus or minus 10. And so what we typically end up doing is we end up giving them some coupons or reducing the price or taking it back and delivering another product to them. But output indicators are important for us, and one of the places where we need to measure, based upon what the standard is telling, product quality is at the output level. The good news is if we work back into the process, we can go back into our pizza manufacturing process and identify those process parameters or process characteristics that have an effect on pizza temperature. One of those may be oven temperature. Clearly, if the oven doesn't get to 125, the pizza ain't ever going to get to 125. And so we can use some basic statistics to relate the oven temperature as the pizza was being made to the pizza temperature as we've delivered it to the customer. And we can use some statistical analysis that make that relationship really solid to us, regression analysis, whatever you want to use. Our goal here, again, is to control the X. If we control the oven temperature, then we essentially control the Y, the pizza temperature at the customer. So these process indicators are important to us. These X's at the process level are very important to us, and we want them to be linked to the output indicators. We shouldn't be measuring things in the process that don't have any effect on the requirements at the output level. We can even take a step further back and talk about the inputs. As an example, if we have a gas oven that we're cooking the pizza in, maybe we can measure the gas pressure coming into the gas oven. Or if it's electric oven, maybe we measure the voltage coming into the building. We know that voltage is related to the oven temperature. We know that oven temperature is related to pizza temperature. So we've got linkage from these X's to those Y's. Excuse me. And the standard, when it talks about measuring, monitoring product and measuring and monitoring process, are talking not only about the Y's, the product, but also these X's. So essentially there are three places where we can do measures, and if we step back a little bit, the standard wants us to understand what needs to be monitored and measured, and where, when, and all the methods that we're going to utilize to do that monitoring. And these three places are key for us to look at. We can even take one step back and talk about the suppliers and measure stuff at the suppliers before it becomes an input. But that, I think, is something that we can think through and talk about further down the road. My goal here is to show you that what the standard wants us to do is understand the outputs. Are we meeting the requirements of the customer? And understanding the inputs and process indicators that affect those outputs. We control the X's, we control the Y's. That's our whole main goal here. All right. Let's take a look at the second half of 911. It says once we've done this, not only do we have to collect good data, but now we have to use it to evaluate the QMS. So I've got product measures, I've got process measures, I've got input measures. How's our QMS working? Is the process in control? Is it stable? Is it predictable? Is the incoming product or processes in control, stable, and predictable? You know, it's performance and effectiveness. Once that's done, then we need to have our records. Retain appropriate documented information as evidence that we've done that. So 9.1 talks about the who, what, where, how, and when of the data. What needs to be collected, making sure that it's collected, and then basically what needs to be done with that data once we've collected it. If we look at 9.1.2, it's the old 8.2.1 customer satisfaction. There's some new words here. but words like perceptions and obtaining and monitoring have been in the standard for a while. Needs and expectations are new. The organization shall monitor customers' perceptions of the degree to which their needs and expectations have been fulfilled, and then determine those methods for obtaining, monitoring, and viewing this information. The note talks about both proactive and reactive methods, and these next couple of slides can take us through a little bit of that. If we look at the reactive stuff, we're generally measuring customer dissatisfaction methods, warranty, complaints, call center logs, contract cancellation, web page hits. Generally what we're doing here is we're waiting for the customer to contact us. And so generally when they do that, it's customer dissatisfaction more than it is customer satisfaction. This data set alone is a biased data set because, again, it's those people that are really angry with us, or in some cases those people that are really happy with us. If we look at a little bit of these customer satisfaction methods, these are the proactive ways to collect our customer sat data. Here we're going to contact the customer. If you look at these opportunities of how we do that, the further down the list we go, the more information we get in general, the more effective that methodology is. For example, emails. For those of you that do emails to the customers, you probably find that you don't get a lot returned. Not that effective. However, if you did phone interviews, you get a lot more information. And you get a lot more information if you do customer immersion, where we're actually at the customer site, talking to them in person. All of these things give us some customer satisfaction data that the standard says we need to be collecting. So it's not good enough anymore, and it wasn't in 2008, to wait for the customer to contact us. We now have to be proactive in contacting the customer. This brings us to the next clause, which is performance evaluation. So in 913, we've combined a whole bunch of stuff from the old standard, 821, 823, 824, and 84. Once again, when we do these combinations, we have some new words and we have some old words on them. Analyze and evaluate, it's always been around. So the organization shall take the data we've said we were going to collect, analyze it, and evaluate that data, and do several things with it. The results of these analyses should be used to do the following. Evaluate the conformity of products and services. This is the old 824, monitoring and measuring a product. B, the degree of customer satisfaction, the 821 we've just talked about. C, the performance and effectiveness of the QMS. These are new words for us. This is how is the QMS, the quality management system, performing as a whole. How do we collect data on its performance, and how are we going to evaluate its effectiveness on the long term? Sometimes we have to really think through what we're going to be doing for collecting data on the QMS in general, and how do we collect data to show that it's effective. D, if planning has been implemented effectively, another new piece to it. In our PDCA cycle, have the planning activities that we've outlined been effective, and what's the data that shows us that? E, the effectiveness of actions taken to address risk and opportunity. Here we go again with risk and opportunity. We're back to 6.1 and 4.1 and 4.2. Back then, we listed and ranked these risks and opportunities. Hopefully, we then took action to mitigate some of them. Now we're being asked to evaluate and assess if they were effective, those actions that we took. F, the performance of external providers. The new words here, external providers, but we've talked about the performance of suppliers before and the performance of subcontractors. So there's a little bit of the old 741 purchasing in here. And our data analysis needs to include the performance of those folks, external providers in the new terminology. And then finally, the last bullet here talks about the need for improvements to the QMS. Again, improvements may be a new word, but we've always talked about how the QMS has been performing. Our analysis needs now to evaluate the need for improvements. What areas of the QMS needs to get better? One of the things we've been telling our internal auditors is that their audits should, not shall, but should include not only where there's a need for improvement or where there's waste, but also what the lost dollars are associated with that waste. If we're able to feed back to management not only the areas that aren't performing up to par, but what it's costing the business that they're not performing up to par, that gives senior top management an opportunity and some data to make some decisions based on what they want to do with improvement activities. It's another skill your internal auditors should know, is how to talk that language of management, that language of dollars, and not just the language of things. How to report those lost dollars due to waste. There's a note here, and the note makes reference to statistical techniques. Interestingly enough, for those of you that remember the 87 standard, it originally had one of its 20 elements as statistical techniques. We've brought it back around now and said, you know, these methods that we're going to analyze the data can include statistical techniques. Typically, when we talk about statistical techniques, we're talking about either descriptive techniques, comparative techniques, or relational techniques. Statistics can be broken out into one of those three. We either use descriptive statistics to describe what the data looks at, like we use comparative statistics to compare different groups, and we use relational statistics. In our pizza example, the relationship between oven temperature and pizza temperature are relational statistics. Comparative statistics, I might compare oven 1 versus oven 2. Does oven 1 manage to keep the pizza hotter with the customer than oven 2? And descriptive statistics might simply be a histogram showing what the temperature over time might be. So all of these can be utilized in terms of monitoring and evaluation techniques. Run charts, control charts, histograms, scatter plots, hypothesis testing, and non-parametric statistics. All of these are typical monitoring and evaluation methods. And the thing that we need to think through now is that these are some more tools and techniques that your internal auditors are going to need to be familiar with. These are the analytical capabilities. Do your auditors know how to read and interpret an SPC chart? Do they understand and are they comfortable with basic statistics? You know, can they tell the difference between a statistical quality control chart and a statistical process control chart, and when the correct choice is supposed to be used? If we're going to continue to use more and more statistical techniques, then the auditors, your internal auditors, need to understand their use and effectiveness. All right, last reminder about questions. Make sure we put questions in the question box so we can answer them a little bit. So as typical, when we get to the end of a clause, we talk about what you should do, and we talk through Karen's 6 steps to 9001-2015 transition. For this particular section, 9.1, well, one of the things you need to do is review your key process, input process, and output indicators, if you have any. And if not, it may be time to start putting some in place. As I said earlier, most of you will have output indicators in place, measuring the product to make sure that the product is meeting requirements. But now we've got to move back into the process. Look at the external provider data. If you have some supplier charts, or if you're looking at doing some supplier report cards, make sure you review that data again to assure that it's being helpful for the organization. We don't want you to collect data just for the sake of collecting it. If you're not analyzing and evaluating it, then you need to think through why are we collecting it to begin with. The same with your inspection data, whether it be in process inspection or final inspection. Generally, these are the output indicators matching up to the requirements from the customer. Are we using appropriate statistical tools to look at this data? I've gone into a lot of organizations where they collect a lot of this data and they make decisions on a daily basis, data piece by data piece, but they're not putting that data together and looking at it as a whole. They're not evaluating it. They're not analyzing it over time. And the standard wants us to begin doing that. Next one is reactive and proactive customer satisfaction techniques. Again, it's no longer feasible just to wait for the customer to contact us. Are we doing proactive techniques, those similar to the ones we've listed there? And are they effective? Are they giving us the data that we need to have? Review the data analysis and the methods, evaluation methods for all the indicators. People know when we're collecting data and not doing anything with it, and the operators get really upset with that. And so part of what we need to be looking through is what is all this data that we're collecting? What is all the analysis and the evaluation that we're doing on these indicators? Is it correct? Is it up to date? Is it helping the business? If not, why are we doing it to begin with? Assess your internal auditor data analysis competencies. As we move more and more into this performance standard, your auditors are going to be asked to be looking at more different data sets. And if they don't have those analysis capabilities, which aren't hard to get, we're not talking about too rocket science advanced stuff. We're talking about some really good basic tools and techniques. If they don't have those tools and techniques, then they're not going to be able to effectively audit the areas as to whether the areas are effective, as to whether the metrics we're using are effective, as to whether the analysis techniques we're using are effective. If they can't do that, then they can't feed back the correct information to top management, and top management needs that information to make decisions moving forward. As is always typical, we want to make these part of the plan. Typically, we'll put them in the high-level plan as a goal, and then in step 5 in the specific actions that we need to do, so we can address who needs to do it and by what time frame do these need to be done by. All right. That brings us to the next section, our internal audit section. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this since we're going to have an internal audit webinar all by itself. The bottom line is not much has changed. There are some new words to the standard in here. There's some new issues in terms of defining the criteria and scope for each audit. And so the one thing that I'll mention is that your auditors may need to rethink how they audit. We really are not only process-based now, but we're also performance-based. And again, they should be looking at data if they're not already doing that. If they don't have those analytical skills we just talked about in the last section, we need to give them those skills to them. And there are different courses you can take, some very, very detailed, some high level. It depends on how much you want your auditors to be trained in these analytical skills. And so we'll talk a little more about this when we get to our internal audit webinar. So keep an eye out for that one coming up soon. Our last item today is our old friend management review. Management review has been around for a while, and most of 5.6 is here in the standard of 931. The general section talks about top management, having those reviews at planned intervals, very typical from what we've seen before, measuring its suitability, the adequacy, the effectiveness, and something new, the alignment of the quality management system with the strategic direction of the organization. So as auditors, we now should be assessing whether the QMS lines up with their strategic direction. Does the QMS help the organization move towards the future? And is it effective in doing that? So different look at what the quality management system is doing. The auditors need to have a feel for what the strategic direction of the company is. And so this may be the first time that some of your auditors have gotten into that strategic direction documentation. And that would be good for them to know. 932 talks a lot about the inputs. And we've seen most of this before. It says management review shall be planned and carried out, taking into consideration the status of actions from previous management reviews. We've always been asked to look at what were the actions coming out of the last management review and what's their status. Are they complete? Are they late? Are they on time? Some of you have been using the red, yellow, green kind of bullets to show us those status of the management review actions, and it's still the same here. Changes in external and internal issues. This is new, and again, it takes us back to the 4.1 and 4.2. Those issues that are relevant to the quality management system. We listed them at the beginning of the year. As we go through our management review, we want to review them to see whether there are changes in those internal and external issues, and all those changes need to be addressed. Information on the performance and effectiveness of the quality management system. And it's got several different bullet points below this, and we've talked through some of this when we've talked through 9.1. The effectiveness of customer satisfaction and feedback from those relevant interested parties. Notice it says interested parties. It just doesn't say customer anymore. to the extent to which those quality objectives have been met. Last time we talked about quality objectives. We said those quality objectives have to be tied into the quality policy. They need to be documented. They need to be SMART, specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. And they need to be disseminated through the organization so people are aware of those quality objectives. Now that we're being asked as an input to the management review, are we meeting those quality objectives? And if not, probably what are we going to do about those, the extent to which those objectives have been met. 3 talks about performance and conformity of products and services. Again, back to the old 823, 824, monitoring and measuring of product, monitoring and measuring of performance and process. And so again, we're looking at input, output, and process metrics. Are we meeting those requirements from the customer? Is the process performing the way we expected it to perform? Bullet point number 4 talks about nonconformities and corrective actions. We've had to review these before. The words preventive action have been taken out because we're going to do risks, and we'll talk about risk in a little bit. And so here we're going to be reviewing what the nonconformities were, internal as well as external, and are those corrective actions effective. Management needs to be looking at those on an ongoing basis. Continuing with the inputs, bullet point 5, monitoring and measuring results. All of this is stuff we've talked about in 9.1. Where are we monitoring? Where are we measuring? What are those results? My guess is most of what we'd be looking at management review is exception reporting, places where the monitoring and measuring have shown a problem. Again, if we have the auditors showing us where the waste is, showing us where the needs for improvements are, those are monitoring and measuring results. And there's the audit results. Hopefully they bring those in. We can look at high-level results of audits as well as very detailed results of the audits. And then the final bullet in this section is the performance of external providers. Nothing terribly new here except the words external providers. We're looking at the performance of suppliers, we're looking at the performance of subcontractors, and that's something we've had to do before. If we move on to bullet point D, it talks about adequacy of resources. Part of what we've had to look at before, do we have enough people? Are they trained well enough? We have the resources in place, not just people, but all the other resources that make up our QMS and make up our production. E talks about the effectiveness of actions taken to address risks and opportunities. So here's the risk piece. This is the new piece. Again, we're going back to 6.1. We've listed what it is that we're supposed to be doing. Are these actions that we've taken to reduce risk effective? And what's the proof that we have those actions at effectiveness? And then finally, opportunities for improvement. Continual improvement was the old terminology. If our auditors have done their job correctly, at this point, top management should be reviewing data on where the waste is. Hopefully they're evaluating and prioritizing those areas so that we can work on the areas of most waste and make sure that the continual improvement opportunities are focused on the areas that are going to give us the biggest bang for the dollar in return. Continuing on to 9.3.3, the outputs piece. Again, stuff that requirements that were in the old standard are still here. The outputs of the management review shall include decisions and actions. So we're going to have decisions and actions, how they relate to those opportunities for improvement we just talked about. We're going to have decisions and actions as how they relate to the need for changes in the quality management system. What isn't working, what is working, what needs to be changed, what can stay the same. And then those decisions and actions as they relate to resource needs. Do we need more people? Do we need more materials? Do we need more equipment? Whatever the resource needs are after they reviewed the adequacy of resources. All of this gets wrapped up into something that we've always typically seen, and that's the retained documented information, commonly known as records. And so we want to make sure that we've got those records to prove that we've done the things that we said we were going to do, evidence of the results of the management reviews. So most of this should be familiar to you, with a few new ads, and from my point of view, some good ads in terms of what the management review needs to look at. So what should we do here in terms of 9.3? How are we going to integrate this into our 6-step transition plan? Well, clearly, we want to review the current management inputs and outputs. Clearly, we want to go back and make sure that at a minimum, they cover the things that the standard says we should be covering. Most of you have a checklist, I would assume, that says here are the things we're covering at the meeting, and so those checklists get reviewed, and assure yourselves that those inputs and outputs in there. We want to review the frequency of management reviews. We've always encouraged companies that management reviews be part of the operational reviews that happen on a monthly basis. Don't just do them once or twice a year. They're not as effective. Make them part of the monthly reviews. Build it into the business so that it's not like it's Thursday, it's time for quality. No, this is something that we do on a regular basis. This is something that's part of our business. It's built into our DNA as we run the business moving forward. And then, as always, make these activities part of step 3, the high-level plan, and step 5 of the actions. That brings us to the what's next slide, and that's it for the requirements piece. I'm going to hand this over to Karen and let her take it from here. I think we've got about 15 minutes for questions, and so hopefully we've got a lot of questions to take through. Karen, you there?
I am, and I've been gathering some questions that have been coming in. I hope that folks who have been making notes will feel comfortable giving your feedback, your questions, your something that I'd really like to hear, what you would like to hear covered in greater detail. Some of the folks I've talked to have pointed out that most of the folks on our webinars, who attend our webinars, are already the leaders. They're the forward thinkers. They're the people who are looking at transitioning this year, are not putting it off to the end. That's why you're on these webinars now. So I'll give some comments about what it shows on this What's Next slide that some of you have seen from our previous webinars. I just want to point out some of the things that we're covering in these advanced workshops that we're doing with our the transition workshops in the lower left corner there. That basically says a transition workshop, and if you've looked at the standard and you've said we're pretty much in alignment with it, I don't know what we're really going to go through. Well, what we would do in a workshop, by example, Joe, if you would flip back to slide 24, I believe it is, where you were talking about statistics.
Sure. I'll get back there.
This is the kind of thing that we're covering in workshops for transition, for advanced audit skills transition. I'm doing one just next week with a company that's very advanced in their management system, and this is the kind of thing we'll be able to go over with them. They're saying, auditors, where you've been going out and looking at compliance with requirements, are we following procedures and so forth. As we look at descriptive, comparative, and relational statistics, those may not be terms that a lot of auditors are familiar with. We're back on, I think it was slide 21, Joe, where it talks about what auditors are responsible for looking at with respect to the perception of the degree. What was it here? Yeah, the perceptions to the degree to which their needs and expectations have been fulfilled. That's a mouthful. What is an auditor really looking at for that? And Joe, now by way of a question to throw at you, I'd like to ask you the question, how would you expect an auditor to evaluate whether the organization is monitoring that?
So one of the things that we would always tell auditors to look at is data. Ask the company themselves, how are you monitoring customers' perceptions? If they come back and they say, we've got a customer survey that we're monitoring customer perceptions with, then I want to see the data. If they come back and they say, we're looking at inspection results, final inspection results, to make sure that the product is meeting the customer needs and expectations, then I'm going to say, show me the data. So most of these, because this is a performance standard now, are going to have some data involved in it. Different types of data, as we can talk about. We can talk about discrete data, we can talk about continuous data. Don't know how detailed we want to get into it today. But if we think through some of the surveys that we send out, and they have a Likert scale, and it goes from a scale of 1 to 5. Well, analyzing that scale is a very different tool set than analyzing some continuous data sets that we have. And so when the customer, or when the internal folks tell me that they're monitoring perceptions based on this data set, then what we would expect the auditors to be aware of is, am I using the right tools to analyze this type of data. You know, a histogram's not appropriate most of the time for a Likert scale. That doesn't really tell me much. Histograms are used for continuous data. And so those are the kind of things that I've been trying to refer to here in terms of the analysis techniques that the individual auditors need to be having moving forward.
So back in terms of next steps, that was where I wanted to go with this, is to say that the level of evaluation, where it talks about monitoring customers' perception, for example, is a very general statement. You could probably avoid getting a nonconformity by an external auditor slapped on you if you're showing some level of, yeah, we look at these, they're presented in PowerPoint format in meetings, we're talking about them, that's our level of analysis. In our transition workshops, where I said we meet clients where they are, that's the kind of thing we're working with clients on. Is if you're not looking at anything, you need to step up. If you're looking at it very qualitatively, without tracking results over time, without doing some of those advanced statistical methods, if you've got enough data to do that kind of thing, we'll guide people through meeting these requirements to a greater degree that really benefits the business. Because I think we've got a lot of people on this call um, who are leaders of audit programs, who are already experienced auditors, and are saying, what is this new standard going to cause me to do differently? Well, as you mentioned, we've got an upcoming workshop being planned. It will be a paid offering on internal auditor skills, advanced skills. We'll also teach those on site, but we'll have a paid offering through the webinar-like system, where we'll be talking about how auditors function to nudge the business in the direction of data analysis rather than simply qualitative, yeah, we did that because the standard says to. We'll be talking about how audit program managers can upgrade their internal auditor skills with respect to data, with respect to raising the organization's expectations about what happens in an audit, where a lead auditor can begin to guide process owners and business leaders to expect their auditors to come in and require data, not a discussion about, but an actual evaluation of results. Let's see, we also talk about internal audits for training and outsourcing. We can do very advanced training as well as bringing new auditors into the fold. But outsourcing is one of the areas that some folks are finding can be valuable because their auditors aren't ready to step up. So by outsourcing audits, they can shadow our auditors and build their internal audit skills on the job. And then gap assessments. I know you've been involved in some of those, Joe, for where companies are saying, okay, I get the standard, what's really changed? When you get a detailed external but consultative gap assessment as opposed to a CB who's coming in and saying, well, would you pass a transition assessment? You can really find the depth in what's involved in making changes that can benefit the business and focus on the strategic direction, focus on the risks and the opportunities of the business. And it all starts at the beginning with understanding ISO 9001. We did have one question that said, does DESARA offer any webinars on descriptive, comparative, and relational statistics in the context of business management systems? Those are included within our on-site workshops and will be included in our paid offering for the next for the audit skills workshop. Let's see. That's I haven't seen any additional questions come in. Wait a minute, I have one here. With respect to management review, would you see HR doing some or most of the reporting to senior management about adequacy of resources, particularly in knowledge-based organizations? That's for you, Joe.
That's for me. I'll take that one. You know, this one really depends on the HR function at the different organizations. There are some organizations that have very strong HR functions, and in those organizations, yeah, I would see this to be part of their responsibility. There are some organizations where this effort has been distributed to the department heads, and then I would see from the department heads' point of view that they would be providing that information to management review, to the person that's coordinating that management review. And so, you know, it depends on how strong your HR organization is, I think, as to whether or not they're going to do this kind of work.
That it wouldn't necessarily fall on a function, but it would be something that that you would expect to be brought up within management review. You can flip back to the management review slide if that's helpful to look at those items that would be expected to be covered there. One of the things I noticed as I studied management review was the tie back to not just the context of the organization, but also to letter E there, the effectiveness of actions taken to address risks and opportunities. So where ISO 9001 does not require a formal risk management methodology to be in place, they nudge the organization in that direction. And that's the stance that DESARA is taking with our clients. Again, meeting them where they are, but building that risk management methodology to the degree appropriate for the organization. So somebody who's doing information security and has a heavy data component already has a degree of risk mitigation built in. TL9000 companies have a degree of that built in, but others are just starting down that path. And so by requiring it in management review, that's an example of nudging the organization in that direction. And I like what you said, Joe, that HR may have a strong component of bringing data in, but it really depends on the organization. There's another question here from someone I know to be very data focused, a person involved in TL9000 with many, many years of experience in conducting audits and working with auditors. And the question is, what does a typical data component of an audit really look like? Before you answer that, Joe, I just wish that this person could be a fly on the wall when Joe Barckett goes in and does an audit of a management system where somebody's used to sitting down and giving a general verbal description of how things work around here. And then Joe walks in and slaps them with, here, I want to see your data. So Joe, maybe you could talk about what a data component of a strong audit really looks like.
So it depends on what area we're in. And Barbara, I think, and somebody has said that I keep dropping. Hopefully I'm not dropping off.
Uh-oh.
So yeah, if you hear me dropping off, let me know. So typical data component. Most of what we see data being presented with today are control charts. The problem that we have is that people are not making a distinction between SQC, statistical quality control charts, and SPC, statistical process control charts. So typically we're looking at control charts in an area, and typically the control charts are at the end. They're control charting an output indicator, which makes them an SQC chart, quality characteristic as opposed to a process performance. Those are all good and well. We need to know whether or not the product or service is meeting the customer requirements. So I want to see those type of charts. They may simply be a run chart with no control limits on them. They might have a goal listed on the run chart. There are some problems with doing that from the process control point of view, but it's still better than not having a chart at all. What I typically am trying to look at is not just the SQC portion, is the product good or bad, because it's too late by that point, but it's the SPC portion. So now that you've shown me that the product is either meeting requirements or not meeting requirements, can you show me the X's, the input indicators or the process indicators that you're tracking that have an effect on that output indicator? And that's where most of my clients get stuck. They haven't thought back into the process and said, hey, you know what? The oven temperature has a direct impact on the pizza temperature at the customer. Why don't we control the oven temperature, put a control chart out there on the oven temperature so that we can make the pizza at the right temperature so that it'll be at the right temperature when it gets to the customer. Now there's a whole bunch of other X's that affect that pizza temperature. Oven temperature is not the only one. But those are the kind of things that I would expect to see moving forward when we do this kind of audit. Not just looking at the pizza temperature customer and saying, yep, let's plot that, we made another bad pizza, but being able to look back at the X's and say, why was that pizza cold? Oh, well, the oven temperature wasn't where it was supposed to be, or the time it sat on the shelf, the cycle time was too long, or we're outside of our delivery area, the distance we had to travel was outside of where we're supposed to be delivering. Because what we need to do now is we need to take those X's, control them. And if we control them correctly and we know the relationships, then controlling the X's essentially controls the Y's. So the short answer is we typically see SPC charts or some form of run chart as part of that data stuff.
One of the things I've seen you do when you go into an audit right off the bat, Joe, is I like to see the way you start with what are the objectives for this process and how do they tie to the quality policy and the overall objectives of the business unit. Um, and then you dig into what is the data that indicates how they're going about that. Because while you can get the pizza there by sending the guy out screaming down the road at 90 miles an hour, it's a lot better to send it out of to send it out of the shop hot, right? To put it in a box that will protect it along the way. So what I see you doing when you look at data in an audit is look for robust, strong processes as backed up by the in-process data rather than only looking at the end of the line. Did they get the results that they wanted?
Agreed, and that's tough for a lot of clients to figure out. You and I have been into some telecommunication companies where they know what the final product needs to look like, but they don't have a clue what the process parameters are to control that final product quality. And it's
That
not
is
an easy aspect.
that is one of the requirements within TL 9000, the telecommunications quality standard, that some people thought, oh, that's overkill. It's already in there in ISO, but it's an additional requirement on TL that requires targets for key process measures that affect product quality. Product and service quality is implied. And those targets for the key process measures rather than the product measures themselves are or they give TL 9000 auditors ammunition to say, hey, where are these? We expect these. You will improve your product quality if you're looking upstream like that. The thing about being a strong auditor is that often the folks who go into auditing, the folks who go into quality engineering and quality management, are people with an engineering background. We have a natural affinity for data. We want to see the data. ISO 9001 is begging us to look for it now. That's where we're going in our audit training, in addition to the fundamentals, but we're driving people in that direction. Well, Joe, oh, wait, I'm seeing a couple more questions here. Right. Some good comments there, and we are very near the top of the hour. I don't see anything else coming in. So at this point, I'd like to thank you, Joe, for an excellent presentation once again, as usual. We'll have our next Key Concept Series webinar in about 3 weeks, and folks, you should begin looking for. We've done a lot of these sample webinars. We will be going back around, upgrading them, enhancing them with the learnings that we've had. That's why they're only up on our website for a couple of weeks at a time. You can get them upon request by coming back to us. If you see one on our site you'd like to have, just hit the contact us, and we'll get in touch and make sure you have access to that. But we will be upgrading them and beginning offering some of these for sale at a at a deeper level, I should say, not a higher level, at a deeper level, more details, things that you can actually use in training with your organizations. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for giving us your time today. And you will hear from us tomorrow. You'll get a link to the recording of this. You can pass around the link to invite others to download a recording themselves. And we hope to see you again in 3 weeks. Thanks, Joe, and thanks everyone for coming. The webinar is
Take
closing
care.
now.